The Church of Global Warming has a habit of relying on scare tactics to get you to put your money in the collection plate. Ignore us at your peril, they say. If you don't give us your money, all the world's ice will melt and we'll all drown. Now, I happen to believe that arguments like that need to be based on science. In 2002, NASA and a group of German researchers launched a satellite called the Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment, or GRACE, 500 kilometers above the Earth, to measure ice loss in the Himalayas. And since then, they've discovered only negligible ice loss and enough new ice to make up for the shortfall. A glaciologist from Bristol University was even quoted as saying the net ice loss in the Himalayas was not significantly different from zero. You won't hear about this from the global warmists. The truth is too inconvenient for the likes of St. Suzuki and Father Gore. What does this mean for false fears of global flooding? For much more, let's turn to Tom Harris with the International Climate Science Coalition. Tom, have you stocked up on your emergency supplies for the global flood yet? And are you now feeling better that the abominable snowman will not melt?
Well, I mean, this is good news for everybody, not just people who oppose the climate scare, but for normal people who don't want to see cities flooded or, catastrophic ice melt. I mean, the bottom line is, according to the GRACE satellite, we're returning to the rate of sea level rise that was during the whole 20th century. It was about 17 centimeters. We're talking about this much per century, hardly catastrophic.
So here's the question. I mean, you scan the various papers, including The Guardian, which I guess is one of the world's foremost boosters of global warming. So I'm interested not just in how Tom Harris sees this, but in Tom Harris, give me a little bit of analysis on how the pro-global warming media see it. I want to give you a little time on this, Tom. What are they reporting?
Well, they're reporting that even though it's not as fast a sea level rise as we saw before, and as what we thought was going to happen before, you see, at the end of the 20th century into the 21st century, the rate of sea level rise did increase a bit. It increased to about 30 centimeters per century, and the IPCC forecast a range of scenarios, but the bottom line is the average they forecast was a 30 centimeter per century rise. Now, that's a lot more than the 17 centimeters per century rise that we saw throughout the 20th century, but basically what we're seeing now is a return to what it has been traditionally over the 20th century. Now, the global warming people are trying to say, well, this is still catastrophic, it's still a threat to the world, but in fact, it isn't. And it's quite funny because in The Guardian, you read the scientists saying that, yes, but even though there's zero, it's still a real problem. And you sort of think, how does that match with the data? And so it just doesn't match with the data anymore. And not surprisingly, climate alarmists are getting more and more funding because the bottom line is the data is not supporting what they're saying, so they have to pump it out even harder.
Well, first they create these models which are based on worst-case scenarios. And then they get real scientific data. The data doesn't comport with the model. I mean, they're not changing the model, they're changing their interpretation. I mean, at some point, nobody's left calling it science.
Yeah.
What do you call it?
Well, I don't know what you call it, but I do see that there's a movement away from global warming to worries about ocean acidification. I think that many of the people in the global warming movement are recognizing that, 15 years of no temperature rise, which is essentially what we've had, now this new information from satellite showing that, in fact, the ice melt in the Himalayas over the last 8 years has been zero, and that the ice melt in all regions of the Earth actually is much slower than they forecast. We're starting to see a movement over to other things like extreme weather and ocean acidification, both of which are not real concerns anyway.
Talk to me about the money, because I'm one of these cynics, I guess, who believes that if there wasn't a lot of money in BS, we'd have a whole lot less of it. So tell me about how much money is at stake if the global warmists start to admit that, I guess we goofed.
Well, across the world right now, there's about $97 billion a year being spent on what's called climate finance. Now, that would be fine if, in fact, most of that was going to help real people adapt to real climate change, because climate changes all the time. It gets hotter and colder, wetter and drier, and people are affected. The problem is the total amount that's going of that $97 billion, only 5% of it is going to help real people in today's world. 95% of that 97 billion is going to this hypothetical idea that we can somehow stop catastrophic climate change. So there's an enormous amount of money at stake, and it'll be very interesting to see what happens. You see, foundations like the Hewlett Foundation in the United States from Hewlett-Packard, they gave over $400 million to one group in 2008, okay, almost $500 million. That was Climate Works Foundation, who then farms out the money to other groups like Al Gore's group and things like that. Now that money is supposed to be spent right up until 2013. They're spending roughly $100 million a year. So they still got a lot of money to spend. So as the global warming scare, disintegrates, I don't know, maybe they're going to ask for their money back.
I got a couple of seconds left here. I want to tie this question to what we were talking about earlier in the show with Milky. I just ask you this straight-up question. You're there in Ontario. If Dalton McGuinty stopped worrying about how David Suzuki feels about him, would energy costs in Ontario come down?
Oh, yeah. And in fact, the forecast by the Ontario government itself is that the cost of electricity will rise about 46% over the next 5 years, not counting inflation, simply because of wind turbine solar panels in McGuinty's plan. So it's going to become much more expensive if we allow him to continue. And yet, it's not a job creator. I mean, we can see that experience in Europe, and we spoke about that earlier.
Tom, thank you.
Right.
Thank you. Weekend. Thanks very much. Tom Harris in Ottawa. Don't forget to tune in.